So Dan, it was what, February 2020, just before COVID, that you and I attended one of my knowledge cafes in London at Regent's University. And the theme of that cafe was to look at the future of universities. And I think in particular, it was looking at the skill set that universities needed to teach. And that was really quite an interesting session. But I think since then, you've been exploring, this whole issue more broadly and more deeply. And I know myself that universities have come in for a lot of criticism these last few years, and there are a lot of people thinking that maybe they won't survive. But at the same time, the need for further education, so higher education, is probably more critical than ever. And I wonder what you make of all of this.
Okay, David. Well, look, the first thing that is important to say is that, of course, universities will survive. They are an essential part of our society. They are absolutely critical to the modern world. They give us a stream of professionals in all sorts of fields that are absolutely essential if we're going to keep anything like the current society going. However, it is also true to say that the universities are at a crossroads, unlike what they've seen for a very long time. There is certainly a lot of criticism. The media picks on universities very regularly and often makes a big fuss about relatively small issues. Uh, I'm not going to say that this is a small issue by any means, but the BBC announced last week that 50 universities in the UK were about to, or were in the middle of student strikes. Um, I don't know how serious that was at the
Yeah, I had actually missed that. What were the strikes over? Do you know?
Well, it seemed to have been something to do with the fact that a really important mistake was made by bringing the students back to university during the COVID crisis.
Okay.
And no sooner were they back than some of them were tested to be positive, and therefore they were effectively isolated in their rooms. Lectures were online, and they were saying, "Look, we're paying rent for a silly little room we don't need, and we could have done this from home." And
Mhm.
indeed, I mean, as I said, I don't want to play down the importance of that issue, but the way it comes across sometimes is it sounds like the universities are in an enormously dire state.
It's interesting, this whole impact of COVID, because people keep talking about I guess, some sort of brave new world post-COVID. And it's maybe the same with the universities, because so many students now are studying online through video conferencing, probably from home. And do you think it's going to return to normal? What do you think is going to happen post-COVID with the universities?
Well, look, the first thing that needs to be said is that the method of teaching online has been referred to by a number of institutions as remote emergency teaching.
Okay.
And I
Yes.
think that's a really good description. There are two wonderful examples of just how emergency this is. Um, there is a um, dean from an American university who announced that on Friday evening, when we all went home, we were a regular university, and on Monday, we were a university that was online. This is
Hmm.
complete nonsense. I mean, it takes an awful lot of work to convert
Yeah,
the
that's true.
standard
Yeah.
traditional physical university into a reasonable online learning institution.
Mm, mm.
Um, there's another example of a similar type of expression, which just showed to go the just showed how easy it is to misunderstand what it's all about. But look, let me just go back one moment to the issue of how important the universities are.
Yeah.
First of all, there has never been a greater need for higher education than there is today. It's needed by society, by industry, or by every aspect of society, industry, government, etc., etc. Secondly, there's never been the demand that there is. Now, look, some universities are saying that the student numbers are dropping off in the UK, but I'm actually talking globally. Globally, the numbers of people who want a university education is absolutely staggering. And that's not going to decrease very, very, very quickly. Oh, not going to decrease at all. I mean, we're going
Yeah.
to see that
Yeah.
for a long time. The second thing is that there is a lot of innovation in pedagogy. There's a lot of innovation in the way that people are being taught and in the tools that are available to support their teaching and learning. Uh, Admittedly, we're still at a point when there's a lot of exaggeration, but important steps have taken place in the use of big data and artificial intelligence, which with a bit of luck will develop into a much better way of being able to facilitate learning.
Is this where when you talk about big data and AI, is this where you're talking about, I guess, more finely tuning
Yes,
um, things
yes,
for the individual student?
that's absolutely right. I mean,
Yeah.
when a lecturer
Okay.
stands up in front of 200 people, there's 200 individual
Yeah.
views of the world there, 200 different experiences. And what does a lecturer try to do? Well, I guess he or she tries to play to some sort of mean. And of course,
Mhm.
that means that the brightest kids get bored and the less bright kids get left behind. So if you can fine tune it into individual experiences, it makes an enormous difference. And there is evidence that a lot of progress is being made in that aspect of.
Yeah, yeah. I've read and I've read a little bit about it, and that does seem to make a tremendous amount of sense and tremendous um, you know, jump forward, really.
Now, the criticism has been intense, and the criticism has been on a number of different fronts. There's the first issue is funding, finance, and education is expensive. There is no doubt about that. And the question as to who should bear it, whether it should be the individual or the state, is
Yeah,
certainly one that is still in the discussion process. But by and large, it is pretty obvious that societies who have encouraged and supported their populations to become better educated have done better as a society in the end of the day.
yeah,
And so we have to look at that very much more carefully than we have been. The costs in many parts of the world are too high. And one can then just look at countries such as Germany and the Netherlands and Scandinavia, where it's basically all funded by the state.
yes,
And one has to ask, how can they afford to do that? Well, they can afford to do it because they see it as essential to the society. That has to be looked at much more closely than we've done in the past. There are issues to do with what I want to call epistemology issues,
mhm,
to do with what is actually taught and how it is taught.
yeah,
In some respects, far too much material is presented at university. It would probably be much better to present
yeah,
less and to
yeah,
present a much more exploratory way of understanding the world. Just from my own background, I recall that I had to read 16 uh, novels for my course in English. I can hardly
mhm,
remember the names
yeah,
of them, never mind
mm,
what the stories were. It would perhaps would have been much better if we had have read considerably fewer, but explore the whole idea of storytelling and
yeah,
novels. And
yeah.
you know, there- there-
I
there's a great
totally agree,
temptation
totally agree with you there.
to put too much in. There are issues with regards to staffing at universities and the way that universities staff members are engaged. There's a great tendency to remove the possibility of permanent work in the university. Tenure, we used to call it, but not many universities have tenure anymore, but they have permanent posts. But there's a lot of people being brought in on what's called sessional engagements, where they're just employed to do a few lectures. This, of course, reduces the cost of the university. It doesn't necessarily build up the sort of cadre of experience that the university
Yeah,
probably needs. There's a whole load of issues related to examinations.
yeah.
Examinations have traditionally been, I'll tell you something and you can tell me it back.
Mm.
Uh,
They've been about memorization, certainly in my day.
Absolutely. Memorization and regurgitation. One of the problems is that the universities have in recent years become large, complex organizations. They are multi-product, multi-function, multi-process. I mean, they do all sorts of things, from running science parks to research to teaching to having campuses all over the world. I mean,
Yeah,
one wonders if they haven't become too complex, or whether they should actually be brought back to the basic tenet that they are there to help develop individual members of society to have a greater or better life experience. So in short, that is largely the criticism. The opportunities on the one side, the criticism on the other side. Well, this debate has been going on, or this question of whether or not universities have been doing the right thing has been going on for several decades. But now we have COVID come into the equation, and the universities have been shaken to the foundation by that. And the idea that the universities had to close and to reorganize, and how well have they reorganized? It's not at all clear that they've done a good job of this. So an investigation needs to be made as to how they can do things a lot better. It's not a question of bouncing back to where they were before. It's a question of looking how they can do this thing better than they used to.
Yeah, so it's looking for the opportunities.
Now, the last thing I'd like to say on this really is that people often say the universities started back in medieval times, and they have been fantastically successful organizations because they've survived almost longer than any other type of organization, perhaps except for the churches and
yeah.
etc. But or things like the churches.
Yes.
But in fact,
back away.
The universities went through an enormous upheaval in the 19th century. What we have today as universities was not invented back in medieval times. What we have today as universities was invented in the 19th century, when the universities had to come to terms with the fact they needed to modernize to cope with how society had changed due to the Industrial Revolution. Universities are essentially a reflection of the society they serve.
Mm-hmm.
And our society is quite different to what it was
It's
50 years ago.
Very different, yes. We're supposedly now in the fourth industrial revolution, whatever that means.
And the universities haven't changed adequately.
Yeah.
And so one hopes that COVID could be a trigger to get them to sit down and to really think this through, and to come up with a fresh look at what their mission is and how they can actually deliver.
No, I certainly hope so, because as you said a couple of times, further education is so important. It's critical to the future of the world. So let's hope.
Well, as the Americans say, it's a no-brainer. It's just it is so obvious. And
yeah, absolutely.
That's,
okay, Dan.
That's my update on the situation.
Thank you for that update. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Nice talking to you.
Good talking to you too, Dan. Thank you.